Jesus Christ, that's a bipedal. Some kind of a bipedal humanoid.
I recorded Bigfoot stalking my farm, and after I did something unbelievable happened that terrorized my farm. What the Sasquatch was trying to do on my property is beyond inhumane, and the proof I filmed with my security cameras is the clearest footage ever filmed. My name is Owen Haskell. I am 53 years old. I have farmed a 240-acre property in rural Garrett County, Maryland for 22 years. I am telling you this because what happened on my property over the better part of a year did not stay one kind of problem. It started as a question about my cattle. It became a question about what was watching my cameras. And it ended as a question I still do not have a comfortable answer to about why something that size would spend 11 months making sure nothing came near my fence line that wasn't already supposed to be there. I run a herd of 43 commercial beef cattle on the lower pasture. The pasture is bordered on the south and west by a timber stand, mixed hardwood, predominantly oak and maple, with a creek bottom that runs along the western edge before it joins the main branch of the Yogiagani drainage. The timber stand borders state forest on the south, which means the property backs up to contiguous woodland that runs without significant break for better than 30 miles toward the Pennsylvania line. I mention the scale of it because it matters for what comes later. This is not a property where you can walk the whole perimeter in an afternoon and call it checked. It takes most of a day to walk the boundary on foot, longer if you are stopping to look at anything, and there is more forest on the other side of my fence than there is farm on this side of it. In the first week of April, the cattle started behaving strangely at night. I know my cattle, 22 years of this operation, and I know what normal night behavior looks like in that herd. The distribution pattern across the pasture, the loose clustering that happens in cold weather, the specific alignment of the herd when a coyote is working the fence. I know the sound a spooked herd makes, and I know the sound of a herd that has settled for the night. These are things you learn because not knowing them costs you calves. The first week of April, I started getting up at 2 and 3 in the morning to the sound of cattle that were not settled. It is a specific sound, and I want to describe it because the description matters later. Not bawling, not the short, sharp distress call a cow makes when a calf has gotten separated, and not the steady, low murmuring that passes between a herd settled comfortably for the night. It was somewhere between those two, an intermittent, low-register sound moving through several animals at once, the kind of sound a herd makes when it has noticed something and is checking with each other about it, rather than reacting to it. I would lie in bed and listen to it start, build for 10 or 15 minutes, and then taper off into something closer to normal. And in the morning, I would walk the pasture and find nothing. No torn fence, no blood, no missing animal, nothing disturbed in the grass that I could point to as a cause. Not in a panic, no running, no fence testing, no vocalization beyond the specific low disturbance sound a herd makes when something has interrupted their rest without triggering full flight response. Something was near the herd at night, and the herd knew it was there and was managing its awareness of it, the way prey animals manage awareness of a presence that they have assessed as present but not yet actively threatening. I put a camera on the south fence line on April 9th. The first capture I want to tell you about came on April 14th, 4:22 in the morning. The camera is positioned at the corner post of the south pasture fence, aimed southwest along the fence line into the timber margin. It is a Browning Strike Force, 12 megapixel, infrared trigger, the same unit I have been running at that position for 4 years. At 4:22 on April 14th, something walked along the timber margin from west to east. The camera captured 9 frames across approximately 6 seconds of motion. In those 9 frames, I can see the following. A figure moving upright, not upright in the occasional bipedal posture that a bear adopts, the specific, temporary uprightness of a bear that has risen for a better view of something and will return to 4 limbs when it is satisfied. Upright in the sustained, default posture way that something walks upright all the time. The stride pattern across 9 frames confirms this: the footfall spacing, the arm swing, the head position. This is not an animal that has stood up. This is an animal that walks this way. The height, estimated against the fence post at the right edge of the frame, a post I have measured, 5 feet 6 inches to the top rail, is approximately 8 feet. The shoulder width in the closest frame is the width of 2 of those fence posts, side by side. I sat in my kitchen and looked at those 9 frames on my laptop for a long time. I am going to say the word I was thinking because this account is not served by dancing around it. I was thinking about Bigfoot, 8 feet tall, upright, wide at the shoulder, walking a fence line at 4 in the morning in western Maryland. 22 years on this property, and I had never thought that word about anything I encountered here before that night. I was thinking about it then. Then I pulled the SD cards from the other 7 cameras. Of the 8 cameras on the property at that time, 5 had captured from the same night, a 4-hour window between midnight and 4:30 in the morning, April 14th. 5 separate camera positions across 240 acres, each capturing the same figure or a figure of the same description at different locations on the property. I want to be precise about the implication of that because the implication is significant. In 4 hours, between midnight and 4:30 in the morning, something had moved through or around my entire property, not past it, through it. From the north woodlot to the south pasture fence to the east equipment shed to the creek bottom on the west, 5 separate camera captures across the full extent of 240 acres in 4 hours at what the timestamps suggest was a circuit. It had walked my entire farm. I did not call anyone. I am going to be honest about this throughout this account because the decisions I made and did not make are part of the story. I did not call the county sheriff. I did not call the Wildlife Management Division. I did not call my nearest neighbor, who is 3/4 of a mile up the road, because any of those calls required me to describe what I had photographed, and describing what I had photographed in terms that would produce a useful response was not something I could do. I ran the conversation forward in my head more than once. What I would say, how it would be received, what would happen to the rest of my season once that word was attached to my name and my address in any official capacity. And every version of that conversation ended the same way, with me looking like a man who needed help that had nothing to do with wildlife. I added 2 cameras and kept the SD cards, and over the next 3 months, I built the kind of record I know how to build, because building a record of something that moves through your land is the only skill I had that applied to this situation. It visited the property on 41 of the 92 nights between May and the end of July. Not every night, roughly every 2 to 3 nights, with occasional gaps followed by clusters of consecutive visits. The approach route was consistent: south timber margin, northeast along the creek bottom, across the lower pasture, to the equipment shed and the barn. The cattle pasture was accessed on every visit, and I want to be specific about what that access looked like because it is not what I expected to find when I first pulled those cards. It did not approach the herd the way a predator approaches a herd. No stalking posture, no low profile, none of the patient closing distance I have watched coyotes use on this same ground. It walked the perimeter of where the cattle were bedded, at a distance that never closed past maybe 40 feet, the way you might walk the edge of something you are keeping an eye on rather than something you intend to take from. The herd, for its part, stopped reacting to it within the first 2 weeks of May. By June, the cattle nearest its usual path would lift their heads, track it for a few seconds, and put their heads back down, the specific low-grade acknowledgement they give to something familiar and not currently relevant. The equipment shed was investigated at close range on 27 of the 41 visits. On 14 visits, the back porch camera caught it at the edge of the yard, never closer than 60 feet from the house. Looking at it, 14 nights, something 8 feet tall stood at the edge of my backyard and looked at my house. By the 6th visit to the shed, the behavior had changed from investigative to specific. The first several visits to the shed had been what I would describe as a kind of mapping, moving along the wall, pausing at the corners, at the equipment door, at each window, the pattern of something, learning a structure's layout rather than looking for anything in particular. By the 6th visit, that mapping was finished. It went directly to the east-facing window, the one I left cracked for ventilation, the one with my police scanner mounted 6 feet inside it, which I have run continuously for 15 years as part of the general security awareness for the property, and stood there for 11 minutes, not moving, not investigating anything else about the shed. 11 minutes at a window with a sound coming out of it, the scanner running through county emergency traffic the way it runs every night of the year. I turned the scanner off. On the next visit, it stopped at the window for 90 seconds, the time I think it took to confirm the sound was gone, and moved on to the barn. I turned the scanner back on. On the visit after that, it went straight back to the window. I am not going to tell you what I concluded from that sequence because I expect you have already concluded it yourself. In August, it found the cameras, not all at once, Over about 3 weeks, one by one, each camera position was identified and handled differently than the last, and I have enough footage from those discoveries that I can describe the process rather than just the result. The south fence camera was first, on August 3rd. The approach was the same as always up to that point, along the timber margin, the familiar gate, except that it stopped at the corner post instead of passing it. It stood there for a moment, and then it leaned in toward the camera housing, close enough that the lens distorts the proportions of its face in the frame, close enough that the infrared caught its face clearly enough that I have spent more hours than I want to admit looking at those frames. It held that position for nearly 30 seconds, not pawing at the unit, not trying to dislodge it, looking into it, the way you look into something when you are trying to work out what it is rather than whether you can break it. Forward-set eyes, a broad, flat nose, wide cheekbones, a heavy, continuous brow ridge, dark hair covering the face the way a beard covers a face, except finer and more complete, running up past the cheekbones with no bare skin showing anywhere I could identify. And in the frames where the infrared catches the eye shine at the right angle, it is not looking in the direction of the camera, it is looking into it. There is a specific difference between an animal orienting toward a stimulus and an animal looking at a thing because it has identified the thing as something that does what this thing does, and I have spent a long time trying to talk myself out of seeing that difference in those frames, and I have not managed it. Within 3 weeks, every camera on the property had been repositioned. Not damaged, repositioned. The south fence camera pointed straight up at the sky, canopy and cloud, nothing useful in the frame. The east shed camera aimed at 4 inches of wall, then the creek bottom unit, then the north woodlot, then the equipment door. Each one lifted from its mount with no sign of damage, angled to capture nothing useful, and replaced. It had disabled my entire surveillance array without breaking a single piece of equipment, and it had done it with enough care that the only evidence of handling was the new angle. I want to be specific about what that means, because it is the detail that moved this, for me, from unsettling into something closer to frightening. Disabling a camera by force is easy and leaves evidence: a cracked housing, a torn strap, a dislodged bracket. What I found instead, 5 times, was equipment that had been lifted clear of its mount, turned with a controlled and deliberate motion, and set back down with enough precision that nothing showed where. That is not the work of an animal investigating an unfamiliar object and losing interest or growing frustrated with it. That is the work of something that understood exactly what the object did, decided it did not want to be recorded, and solved the problem with the smallest possible amount of disturbance to the evidence of having solved it. I ordered 6 new cameras, different housing, different mounts, and put the old ones back as decoys with no SD cards inside. Within 2 weeks, the decoys had been repositioned. The new cameras had not been touched. It had a working model of which equipment was mine to watch with and which equipment had already been dealt with, and it updated that model the moment I changed anything. That is the sentence the evidence produces. I stopped thinking of it as a security problem somewhere around then, because a security problem is solvable, and what I had was something that was studying my farm with more patience than I was studying it. In September and October, it started leaving things on my back porch. The first time, I almost missed it. I came out at 6 in the morning to feed the barn cats, and there was a small grouping of objects sitting at the base of the steps, close enough to the bottom riser that I had to look twice before I registered it as anything other than debris blown in overnight. A creek stone, a section of oak branch stripped of bark in long, even strokes that no animal's chewing or rubbing produces, and a cluster of wild ginseng root, dirt still clinging to it, pulled rather than cut. They were not scattered the way wind scatters things. They were grouped with a clear center and a periphery, the kind of arrangement a person makes when they are presenting something rather than discarding it. A second arrangement appeared 11 days later in almost the same spot. This one was different in its particulars and identical in its logic. A larger stone, a piece of deer antler that had been shed naturally rather than cut, and a strip of green painted wood I recognized immediately because it matched the siding on the east face of my own equipment shed. Each deposit drew from a different part of the property: water, forest, my own structures. One object from each category every time, laid out with the same deliberate grouping as before. The third arrangement, on a Wednesday in October, included one of my own trail camera mounting brackets, one I had used before I switched to the decoy setup, the kind I had assumed simply went missing in the handling of all that equipment. It had not gone missing. It had been kept for weeks, and then returned to me in a context that made its meaning hard to avoid. placed at the center, surrounded by the now familiar stone and stripped wood, with grip impressions pressed into the plastic housing at an angle and with a pressure no human hand makes, the kind of grip force that is ordinary for something built considerably larger and stronger than I am. It was telling me it knew about the cameras and that it had taken one and that it wanted me to find out. I sat with that bracket on my kitchen table for a long time, turning it over, running my thumb along the deformed plastic. Then I went out to the back porch at dusk and looked at the south tree line until the light went, and I did not see anything, though I have thought since about what it might have seen. A man who had spent 8 months pointing cameras into the dark, finally sitting still in the open, looking back. The arrangement stopped after October. The visits did not. The frequency held through the rest of the fall. Same route, same hours, same managed distance from the house. I assumed by early November that I had reached some kind of plateau with it, that we had each taken the other's measure and settled into a wary, mutual arrangement that was not going to change again. I had started, against my own better judgment, to feel something close to comfortable with the shape of it. 11 months is long enough to build a routine around almost anything, even this. I was wrong about that on the 9th of November at the south fence line at 6 in the morning in a frost so heavy it had silvered the whole pasture. I want to tell this part exactly the way I found it, because I have gone over the order of discovery many times since, and the order matters. It is the order that turned a strange morning into the thing that has kept me up since. I was walking the south fence to check a section of wire that had been loose since the previous week, carrying a roll of new wire and a pair of fencing pliers, the way I have walked that fence on 100 mornings before this one without finding anything I needed to think twice about. The sun was not up yet. The frost that morning was the heaviest I had seen since the previous winter, thick enough on the pasture grass that my boots left a clean, dark print with every step, thick enough that I could see my own breath holding in front of me without moving for longer than it should have. Anything that had crossed that ground in the last several hours had left a track you could read from 20 feet away, a dark, disturbed path cut through silver, and I noticed the first of those paths before I had gone 50 yards, because it ran roughly along my fence line, which is the kind of thing I check out of habit before I check anything else. It did not run along my fence line. That was the first thing that struck me as wrong, and it took a moment to register exactly why. It ran along the outside of it, on the timber side, and instead of moving from one point to another, the way a travel route does, it doubled back on itself again and again in a tight repeated weave that covered the same 80-yard stretch of ground maybe a dozen times over, by my count of the overlapping frost track where one pass had crossed another, back and forth, not a path. A pattern, the kind of mark that only gets left by something that has stayed in one stretch of ground for a long time, moving the entire time, without going anywhere. Pacing my fence line on the outside, the entire night, by the look of the frost disturbance. I stood there for a minute before I went any further, because that alone was enough to stop me. 11 months of cameras and arrangements on the porch and repositioned mounts, and I had never once found sign of it simply staying in place this way. Agitated by the look of the track working the same ground over and over instead of moving through on its circuit the way it always had. Whatever had walked this stretch the night before had not been passing through. It had been doing something, and it had been doing it for hours. At the eastern end of the pacing track, where the fence line bends north along the edge of the timber stand, I found the second set of prints, and that is when the morning stopped being merely strange and started being something I had to sit with, not the ones I had spent 8 months learning to read at a glance. Smaller, narrower in the stride, with a different rhythm to the spacing, quicker, lighter, four-toed, with claw marks scored into the frost just ahead of each pad. A gait pattern I know because I have walked behind it on this land for 22 years and tracked it through every season there is, in mud and snow and dust, and now frost. Coyote. A big one, judging by the spacing between prints, but unmistakably a coyote, and not one animal traveling alone. 3 separate sets, moving together, the kind of loose triangular formation a small pack holds when it is moving with purpose rather than just ranging. I followed that second track and found that it told its own story, distinct from the pacing but woven through it, at 6 separate points along the same 80-yard stretch. Each time the 3 sets approached the fence line from the timber side, closing the distance steadily, the stride shortening the way. A stride shortens when an animal is closing in carefully rather than charging, and each time at almost exactly the same distance out, I paced it off later, 29 to 32 feet, 6 times, close enough to call it the same number. The 3 sets stopped, bunched, and turned back into the trees. No closer approach on any of the 6. No second attempt from a different angle. 6 clean stops at 6 places along roughly the same line, like there was a line drawn in the frost that none of them were willing to cross. 6 places along that 80-yard stretch where 3 coyotes had approached my fence line in the dark and stopped, and turned around and gone back the way they came, every single time. I have run cattle on this property for 22 years. I have lost calves to coyotes twice in that span, both times in hard winters when the deer thinned out and the den pressure on the ridge got bad enough that a fence line stopped being much of a deterrent on its own. I know what a coyote pack looks like when it has decided a pasture is worth the risk of a fence and a porch light and a man with a rifle, because I have stood over the evidence of that decision twice, and it is not something you forget. It does not look like 6 approaches and 6 retreats in a single night without a single attempt at the wire. Coyotes that have committed to testing a fence test it. They probe weak points. They circle. They do not simply walk up to the same spot 6 times and lose their nerve for no visible reason. Something had made them turn around 6 times in the same place all night, and something was not the fence. I followed the pacing track all the way to its end at the southwest corner post, and that is where I found the place it had stood the longest. A wide, packed-down ellipse in the frost, the silver crushed flat and dark across an area roughly the footprint of a small car, facing out toward the timber, the kind of mark that does not come from passing through a place, but from standing in it, weight shifted from foot to foot for a long stretch of time. I have seen cattle leave a mark like that on a cold night when they bunch and hold position for hours. I had never seen anything leave a mark like that alone, upright, at the edge of my own fence line, facing the exact direction the coyotes had come from every time. I stood at that corner post for a long time myself, working out what I was looking at, turning the 2 tracks over against each other until they stopped being 2 separate things and became one story. For 11 months, I had built a careful record of something that studied my equipment, learned the layout of my structures, listened at my window, and left objects on my porch steps that I had eventually learned to read as a kind of communication. I had organized every part of that record around a single question: what does it want from me? What is it trying to tell me? What am I to it? I had not once asked what else might want something from this farm. I had not asked whether the reason I had gone 20 years without a 3rd bad coyote winter, the reason the herd had held steady at 43 head with no calf losses at all since the spring before any of this started, might have a cause I had simply never had reason to look for, because nothing had ever forced me to look. Whether the cause of that good fortune had been standing 80 yards from my fence line at 6 o'clock that morning, walking the same stretch of ground back and forth in the frost all night, holding a line that something else had spent 6 separate attempts trying to cross before it finally gave up and went back into the trees. I did not sleep well that week. I went back out to that stretch of fence the next 4 mornings before first light, with a flashlight and the same roll of wire I never got around to using, and on 3 of those 4 mornings, the frost held a new pacing track in roughly the same place, the same tight repeated weave along the same 80 yards. On 2 of those 3 mornings, the coyote sign was there as well. The same 6-point pattern of approach and retreat from the timber side, the same stopping distance, near enough to 30 feet each time that I have stopped bothering to measure it more precisely than that. On the 4th morning, there was nothing at all. No pacing track, no coyote sign, just frost, undisturbed, the whole length of the fence line quiet in a way that should have been a relief, and instead made the back of my neck go cold, because I had no way of knowing whether that meant the coyotes had given up, or moved on to test a different stretch of fence, or a different farm entirely, with no one standing between them and whatever they were after. It is still out there walking that line some nights. I do not know if I will be walking it tonight. I have not put a camera back on that stretch of fence, and I want to be honest about why. I have decided I do not want a clear answer to what happens on the night the coyotes do not turn around. Some part of me believes that not knowing is the only reason I have been able to keep doing this the way I have been doing it. Feeding the herd, checking the wire, sleeping in my own house at night, on a property where something I cannot name has apparently been standing between my cattle and a threat I never knew was testing them. The scanner is still running in the shed, every night, same as always. The new cameras are still up, untouched, recording whatever they record. I have not gone back to the southwest corner post since the 4th morning. I tell myself it is because the wire held and there was nothing left to fix there. That is not the whole reason. I do not know what is going to happen at that fence line next. I only know that whatever has been walking my farm for 11 months is not finished with the part of its work that I have not been allowed to see, and that the part I have not been allowed to see may be the only reason any of the rest of it was ever survivable, not just for me, but for everything on this property that cannot put up a fence of its own. Some nights I stand at the kitchen window instead of going out to the porch, and I look at the dark line of the south tree line from inside, with the lights off, the way you look at something you have decided you would rather watch than meet. I have not seen it since November. I have not stopped looking. I keep the rifle by the back door now, where it never used to need to be, not because I think I will need it for the thing that walks my fence line, but because I no longer know for certain what else might be out there on a night when the usual arrangement does not hold.